All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for hanging in through Municon. My name is Heidi Siegelbaum from the Washington Stormwater Center, and it's my pleasure to introduce Jennifer Tabanico from Action Research in California, and she's going to talk about this incredibly important issue of survey best management practices for informing and evaluating behavior change campaigns. And we have a very nice leisurely set of time to learn from Jennifer, and then please put your questions in the chat and we will take them later on in the session. And welcome.
All right, thank you, Heidi, and thanks so much for having me here today. Again, my name is Jennifer Tabanico. I am president and owner of Action Research. We are a behavior change firm based in Southern California, actually in the northern part of San Diego County. And for nearly 20 years, we've been working to apply both marketing and social science research to outreach programs that promote safe, healthy, and sustainable communities. So all of the work that we do is focused on behavior change, both the research around how we can change behavior, as well as the implementation and evaluation of programs aimed at changing behavior. So for the time that I've been doing this work, like I said, nearly 20 years, I've worked across a wide range of topics. I've done a lot of work in the area of waste and recycling, and transportation, energy conservation behaviors. You can see them all here, even some health and public safety. But where I've probably worked the longest and where I'm always most excited about working is in the area of watershed protection and stormwater pollution prevention. I've worked on stormwater programs for more than 14 years now, and like I said, it's probably one of my favorite. There are so many behaviors embedded. You can see the impacts of litter reduction or pet waste reduction, see the impacts of your efforts on water quality monitoring, and so on. So I find that work really rewarding and really excited to be here as part of this conference with like-minded or similarly focused individuals. So I would suspect that there's probably something else that we all share in common, and that is that, let's just say since January, think back and how to yourself, whether you have been asked to complete at least one survey. So maybe it's a phone call you got just as you sat down for dinner, a survey in the mail, maybe it was a text-based message, or even a link at the bottom of a receipt where you were asked to complete some sort of survey related to a purchase that you made. I also suspect that even if you haven't completed a survey in the last 3 to 4 months, it's likely that you have heard the results from a survey or a poll. So, having just come out of an election a few months back, we heard lots and lots of survey results, but there have been many other health surveys, public surveys, and so on that are presented in the news. Maybe you read them in a report or even heard the results of surveys in presentations that you've listened to in this conference. So surveys are indeed everywhere. It's hard to get through a day without coming across one, either as a participant or as a consumer of surveys. And many of you in this session, if you are logged in here today, it's likely because you have either administered a survey or maybe hired a consultant to administer a survey, or maybe you're planning on doing so in the future. So the learning objectives in this presentation then I'm hoping will help you to get the most out of your time, effort, and resources, both staff and financial resources, regardless of whether you are a survey participant, you're taking a survey and deciding whether it's worth your effort. If you're consuming research information, if you are reading about a survey and being critical of those results, and then of course, if you are planning on administering surveys for your agency. So through this presentation, by the end, we should all know when to survey, and more importantly, or just as importantly, when not to survey. How to make decisions about how to survey, so how to reach the audience with the survey and how to get them to participate. How to write good questions for meaningful results. So surveys are about as good as the questions that go in them. And if the questions aren't good, the data that comes out isn't good, and the decisions that you make as a result are also not good. And finally, just being a critical consumer of survey reports, whether are there those you come across in the news or in presentations, or even that given to you by your own consultants, being able to really understand and be critical of that information. So first we'll talk about why we would do surveys in the first place. And in my experience, surveys are all too often an afterthought. And we think about, oh, the last thing that we think about when we're putting together budgets, and often skipped as part of the process. But there are really important reasons to be conducting surveys. The primary value and function of a survey is that they can help us to plan. They can help us make decisions about who needs to be reached with what information, and where different target audiences lie, how we can segment our target audiences. Surveys can also help us to make predictions. They help us to test how a particular audience might respond to a message. It helps us understand how people might support a particular public program, or how they might respond to a particular program. And lastly, surveys can also help us to evaluate our programs. They can tell us whether we've done a good job at reaching the audience, whether we've changed knowledge, whether we've changed awareness and attitudes, and importantly, to some extent, they can tell us whether we have changed behavior. There are a few different types of survey modes, and we could do an entire course on survey practice and survey modes, but I just wanted to kind of introduce you to some of the basic terminology. So survey modes kind of fall into two major categories. First are those that are interviewer administered. So this is an interviewer that is delivering the survey either over the telephone, those have been pretty common historically, or in person. So somebody approaches you as you're out in public, or maybe they come to your door and ask you to complete a survey. The second category of surveys are those that are self-administered, and these are typically mail surveys, surveys that are completed on the web, and increasingly surveys that are completed via text message and responses within your messaging platform. In selecting what survey mode is most appropriate, there's a number of things that we need to consider. First is the topic. Is it a sensitive topic? Is it a topic that only pertains to certain people? Is it a complex topic? If it's a complex topic, summarizing complex technical information on something like a written mail survey may be difficult. And so that may require something that is administered by a person who could help to explain technical content. Also, the questions that are asked is something that you would consider. Are the questions multiple layers? Are people going to skip around? Maybe certain questions won't qualify. They won't qualify for certain questions, or maybe subsets of questions only pertain to certain sets of the audience, and they would be skipping around again. So that would be less amenable to a written survey and more amenable to in-person. We also consider the audience. Is the audience speaking multiple languages? If so, having a mailed survey with several different languages would be difficult, whereas a telephone survey can very quickly move to an interviewer that speaks the appropriate language. You might also consider at this level how technically savvy the audience is. Do they have access to the internet? If it's a rural audience, do they have reliable access to the internet and quick enough access to the internet to be able to complete something online? And then resources, looking at your own resources in terms of staff time and budget can drive you to make different choices about how to administer that survey. And there may be other constraints. So for example, if there is federal funding involved, you may need to consider the time for approval of your survey before administering. So each of these considerations should be thought about carefully before making a decision whether that survey will be self-administered or in-person or interviewer administered, and then within those, what mode. So like I said, we're not going to get into these details, but I did want to throw it out there out front as something to consider before we just dive into surveys. I thought it would be helpful before we dive into specifics to just provide a few examples of how agencies have used surveys to plan, predict, and evaluate their programs, and specifically programs related to stormwater. So in this first example, this was a survey to plan a new campaign. And in particular, this campaign was focused on decreasing the amount of pet waste located along a popularly used trail in Oceanside, California. So this is a 7-mile trail that runs inland all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and it's used by bikers, runners, and people walking their dogs. And there was a large amount of pet waste that was accumulating on this trail. So the city decided to do a mail survey for this particular effort, and the primary reason for that was that the people who were accessing the trail were residents who were living in the neighborhoods immediately adjacent to the trailheads. So doing a telephone survey across the whole city would be casting too wide of a net, whereas doing a mail survey of those neighborhoods immediately adjacent to the trail would get us exactly who we needed. On that survey, we were able to identify the needs that the target audience had. So they were asked, what is the primary reason you would not pick up after your dog? Or if there was ever a reason you didn't, what was the primary reason? And we learned that it was not what was being assumed by the city, which was, well, they don't care about water quality, and they don't know that it transmits disease, and they don't know that it's the law. But instead, we disconfirmed those hunches and identified the specific needs of the audience, which were, in fact, if I don't pick up after my pet, it's because I forgot a bag, the trash cans were too far away, and the primary reason for picking up after a pet was social responsibility. So what that did with that audience information is it directly influenced the design of the program. So rather than focusing signage on the legal implications or even the disease or water quality implications, the focus was on social responsibility. And then the program also included additional trash cans and provision of pet waste pickup bags, directly informed from research with the target audience. In this second example with the city of San Diego, this was a survey that was done to predict how the public would react to a new street sweeping program. And in particular, this was a street sweeping pilot that aimed to sweep using improved equipment as well as increased frequency of street sweeping. And the idea from the city going into this was that businesses are going to be so upset. Everyone's going to be so mad. We've already had complaints. But what we did was suggest an in-person survey because this was with businesses in a very specific area. So, and business owners are generally busy and hard to contact. So just a drop-in in-person survey of those business owners and managers allowed us to gauge opinion of a representative sample of those businesses. And ultimately, we found that most people were actually supportive of the increased street sweeping. They saw it as something that would provide value to their business, not only in terms of supporting environmental protection, but as well as keeping their storefronts cleaner. And so some very minor adjustments were made to the program just to accommodate some concerns about parking. But by and large, that survey really changed the way that the city was going to go about that program. Instead of responding to a few people that called via a hotline, a representative survey gave them a better understanding of how the program would be received. And then lastly, this example also from the city of San Diego. Surveys can be used to evaluate the efficacy of a program. For the most part, they're used to evaluate knowledge and awareness. So for about 15 years, the City of San Diego's Think Blue program used a citywide telephone survey to gauge changes in knowledge, attitudes, and behavior over time. So specifically, this allowed them to test whether people had heard of their brand, whether knowledge about the concept that stormwater was not treated before being released into waterways had increased over time, and for whom. So what this allowed them to do was to see that for some audiences, knowledge and attitudes were changing over time, but for others, so for example, younger males, it was not changing to as great of a degree. And that allowed them to segment the audience and focus specifically on those that still needed to move. The surveys also included measures of behavior, and so this allowed them to track changes in behavior over time. as well as identify priority areas to focus on in the future. So just a few different examples of how surveys have been used, but surveys are not always necessary. And so I think it's really important before diving into how to write a survey to first ask yourself, do we need a survey or not? And you might be surprised by this, someone who does surveys for a living. My answer is to always assume no. Always assume that you don't need a survey, and then ask yourself why you should survey. So too often, I think agencies jump into just writing a survey because they think that's going to give them all of the information they need. But surveys are time intense and resource intense. And so we should always make sure that that is the right tool. First, we want to make sure it's a good use of resources, especially those of us who are working with public funds. Can we justify the use of those funds to get the answers that we need? Also, is it a good use of participant time? As we started this presentation, thinking about all of the surveys that are out there, everywhere we go, everyone from your cable company to the coffee shop are asking you to complete their surveys. And so is your survey going to be a good use of time for the participant, and what value will it provide to the participant? Third, is it the best way to get the answer? If you're really wanting to know about the efficacy of a targeted program, a survey might not be the best way to get that answer. If it's a behavior that you can observe, doing those observations might be a better way to measure behavior than asking people if their behavior changed. And we see this particularly for behaviors that we know are very socially desirable, like picking up after your pet, like litter, like overwatering of lawns. People know what they're supposed to do and tend to report the right answer, and that may or may not give you good information about whether your program was effective. And then lastly, ask yourself, is this something that I need to know, or is it something that I would like to know? And that's a really important distinction, and it will flow through into how we design our surveys. Often there are other ways to get the information. I mentioned behavioral observations, but we can also look to see if others have already measured what we need, and can we draw sufficient conclusions from that? Surveys are also more than just asking questions. Even though we will talk about on this presentation how to ask good questions, surveys are a mix of science and art, and they are also an investment. So in terms of science, we want to design surveys so that they are generalizable. So they're not just sort of only relevant to those people that we ask, but relevant to our target audiences, and that they provide meaningful data. And if we construct questions with it in the wrong ways, the data that comes out will not be meaningful. So there's a science to that, which we'll talk about. Second, surveys are an investment. They do take time and they do take effort to be done well. And those well-designed surveys then become an asset. So done well, survey results can be something that you draw on time and time again as you make decisions about how to go forward, maybe as you ask for more funding or justify the existence of a particular program. And then lastly, surveys are an art. There are very fine nuances in the way that we ask questions and the way that we approach people and the methods that we use that can greatly enhance response. So even in the midst of all of these surveys that are out there, we can get people to participate to a great degree by using the art of surveys. So now we'll get into talking about the good stuff, and that is, how do we develop a good survey? And we've kind of become in terms of technology and the rapidness that's developing and the accessibility and these user-friendly interfaces, everybody can develop a survey, whether it's on Google Forms or SurveyMonkey. There's many free platforms out there. It's relatively easy to develop a survey. It's not as easy to develop a good survey, but there's a process that I'm going to show you that will help to ensure that you develop good surveys. So first is, we think about writing surveys, and what most people do is they just start writing questions. Well, you would never build a house by just starting to pour concrete and put up walls. You would always start with a blueprint. And that's the same thing that we do with developing surveys. So the very first thing before you even think about what kind of questions you're going to ask is to clarify the objective. What is it that you want to learn from this survey? And this is particularly important if you have a lot of stakeholders that are working together on a survey, or different departments or even different organizations that are working together. What is the reason for doing the survey? What is the primary thing that you want to learn? And write that out. So writing out a mission statement, just as you would for a business or organization, writing a statement for your survey that outlines what are the primary objectives and maybe secondary objectives. So maybe your primary objective is, we want to know what people need in order to install green infrastructure or to maintain certain stormwater facilities on their property. So, and then there may be secondary objectives, such as we want to know how people perceive X, Y, or Z. But clarifying these things up front is essential. Next, we're still not listing questions. We're actually going to do the opposite of what would be intuitive here, and that is start by listing the answers. What are the things that you need to answer as a result of the survey? So what are the specific answers? That's a little bit different from the overarching mission, but what are the specific answers that you need? So here you're focusing on general themes, not the wording of the questions. And what this does is a couple of things. One, it makes sure that you don't miss anything, that you're getting the key topics that will answer the questions that you need and meet the objectives of your survey. It also allows you to keep a nice refined survey instrument, because each thing that you list can be checked against your objective or your mission statement. And ask yourself, is this necessary to my objective, or does this provide me with the answers that I need? And those can just be general mind dumps initially in terms of all of the themes and answers that you want. And then once they're all listed out, you can begin to organize them into groupings. So for example, you might organize some things into fertilizer use, or insect management, or irrigation, or pet management. So clustering those things together would be the next step. Then we can begin to write the survey. So we've got a mission statement, we know what answers we're trying to get, and we've organized them into categories. Now we can start thinking about what kinds of questions could we be asking? So what is the format of the questions? And in general, you have two choices. First are open-ended questions. These would be broad questions like, what do you think of when you hear the word stormwater? Here you're really interested in people's qualitative responses. You're looking more for sort of an in-depth response. Maybe you don't know what people think at all, so you can't really come up with any categories. And these open-ended items would give you that information. A caution with open-ended items, however, is that they take a lot of time. They take a lot of time for the participant to complete. Some may answer in 2 or 3 words. Some may answer in 2 or 3 paragraphs. So what happens then is you get a lot of information that then needs to be coded in order to be able to be analyzed. So that can take a lot of time and add a lot of cost and time to both the administration and analysis of your survey. So wherever possible, you want to limit open-ended items to just a few, if any, on your surveys. The preference for a survey format is toward closed-ended items. And these are items that have an answer, a yes or a no, a 0 to a 10, a category that is chosen. So for example, in the last year, did you or anyone else apply fertilizer to your lawn? That would be a yes or a no, a closed-ended. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on here. Typically, open-ended items are better suited to an in-depth interview where you're having a conversation with somebody, or a focus group format, or even a public meeting. In terms of closed-ended items, there are two major categories actually that we'll talk about. First are scales. And you may have, across all of the different surveys you've done in your life, seen many different kinds of scales. Some are maybe 1 to 4, you've got a 0 to 10, 1 to 7. What does that all mean, and what do we choose? Well, there isn't a really clear answer to that. It really depends on the topic. But in general, we see that 6, 7, or even 11-point scales, which would be like a 0 to 10, are preferred instead of 3 or 4 points. And just the reason for that is it gives you more variability. So if you have something, for example, you're asking people to rate their agreement, where 0 is, I don't agree at all, and 4 is, I absolutely agree. And it's not a topic where there's a lot of variability. Maybe everyone just generally agrees, you get all 4s. And that doesn't really tell you much. Oh, okay, well, everybody agrees. Well, we kind of already knew that, but how much? Whereas if you use a 0 to 10, everyone on the agreement side, so above a 5, you've got some room to move. So some of those agreeers might be an 8 or a 9, or some of those agreeers might be a solid 10. It gives you a lot more information to work with than those smaller scales. The second thing to consider with scales is whether you want a midpoint or a neutral answer. And again, there's no right or wrong answer here, but it's something that you need to ask yourselves. Is it the kind of question where you want to push people to agreement or disagreement? Or do you feel like it's something where you providing that neutral point would still give you good information? With scales, it is important to not label each number. So if you have a 0 to 5 scale, you would label the 0 never and the 5 always. What you don't want to do is label the 0 never, and then the 1 sometimes, and then the 2 neutral, and then the 3 often, and then the 4 always. So because what that does is then take this scale where there was an equal distance between a 0 and a 1 and a 1 and a 2, and you turned it into categories. And as soon as we put things into categories, we really limit what we can do with it statistically. Because when people are choosing categories, we can only report the frequency of people that fall into each of those categories. So we could say that 50% of people agreed and 50% of people strongly agreed. That's pretty much all that we could say, even if they circle, half of people circled a 4 and half of people circled a 5. Whereas with numbers, if you just label the endpoints, 0 is always never, 5 is always always, but the distance between a 4 and the 5 is the same. If half people pick 4 and half people pick 5, you can calculate an average of a 4.5. So just something to think about when you're constructing scales, and we don't need to get into all the statistics on here, but labeling the endpoints rather than each number is the most important thing to remember with scales. And then lastly, just in terms of getting people to actually complete your survey, it's a good idea to limit your scales to just a few types. So what happens is the participant tends to start learning the scales and can complete the survey faster than if you have a 4-point scale here and a 7-point scale here and an 11-point scale here. So this is a decision that's made early on based on the kinds of questions that you have and how much spread you think there's going to be around those responses. So here's just a couple examples of questions that have used a scale with the endpoints measured. So the top example there comes from a survey on water conservation. So for example, using a scale from 0, not at all important, to 10, extremely important. How important is it to your household to have a green lawn during the summer? And you can see it goes from 0, not at all, to 10, extremely. You might get really different answers. In fact, I know you would get very different answers if you ask this as how important is it to your household to have a green lawn during the summer? Not at all, somewhat, very, extremely. So if everybody circled very or extremely, this doesn't tell you as much as if some people circled the 4s and 5s and some people circled 9s and 10s. You can do a lot more with the information. You can also use that to measure agreement. So in the bottom example, using a scale from 0 strongly agree to 10 strongly disagree to 10 strongly agree, Please rate your agreement with each of the following statements about why you may or may not remove armor from your shoreline. So you can get information about the reasons that people might not engage in your behaviors based on their agreement. You can also use it to get a sense for people's attitudes. So rating the seriousness of a particular source of pollution, for example. Again, 0 to 10 is what we often use. The second type of survey item, so we talked about scales, which are going to be the most common. The second type of closed-ended items are categorical items. And categorical items are generally used when the distance between ratings doesn't matter. So as we talked about the importance of labeling just the endpoints, as soon as you label each of the responses, it becomes a categorical question. And with categorical questions, we can only report the frequencies. We can report the number of people who answered in each category, or we can report the proportion or percentage of people who answered in each category. So these types of questions are best for demographic questions such as gender or home ownership. So you own your home, you rent your home, your level of education or knowledge. So multiple choice questions around, knowledge that stormwater is treated or not, for example. So here's a survey that used primarily categorical items. So asking people whether or not they had seen your program tagline, asking people whether or not they know asking multiple choice regarding their knowledge of certain stormwater topics, or what methods they use for engaging in a certain behavior. So in these cases, we're not interested as much in averages. We want to know what proportion of the population falls into each of these categories. So here's a couple other examples. How often to use insecticide in the areas outside of your house? Where do you typically apply insecticide? Those are all types of questions that we're more interested in categories. So you've got your mission statement, you know what themes you're going to ask about, you've thought about how you are going to construct scales or what scales or category or categorical items are going to be most appropriate. The other type of item to consider are the demographic items. So these are almost always going to be categorical, but two considerations here are limiting those to relevant data for a couple of reasons. One is that it adds length to your survey. So, if you have all of the statistical purposes only questions and you're asking about age and income level and housing status and number of kids in the home, it's really important to ask yourself, do I need all of these pieces of information? Am I going to do something with that information? Is it meaningful? Or am I just asking it because, that's what I've seen on other surveys? So really limiting it to relevant data will make sure that you have a concise survey and also take less pressure off of the participant to be answering these more personal questions. Most importantly with demographics, though, is that they're almost always placed at the end of the survey, because very often asking people questions about their status, such as their race or ethnicity or gender or other personal characteristics can tint the rest of their responses or bias the rest of their responses in undesirable ways often. So there's a concept called stereotype threat, and a lot of research done on that, for example, where women, this is just one example, so if females are asked about their gender at the beginning, before taking a math test, they perform worse on the math test because being asked that question primes their their perception and stereotypes that they might be aware of related to their gender and math performance. And so wherever possible, we want to be asking questions about demographics at the end. The only exception is when that question is a qualifier. So if the question you're going to ask, for example, only applies to people who have children or to people who own their homes, then you're going to need to ask those up front, because anyone who doesn't qualify then skips to another part of the survey, or people who do qualify get a different set of questions. So that's the only time you want to be asking those types of questions up front. So now we'll get into a little bit of best practices around how to word the specific questions. And this is this part where even just very small nuances in the ways that questions are worded or the order in which they're presented can have really profound impacts on the results that you get. So a couple of best practices here, and again, this isn't all of them. We could do an entire series on writing survey questions, but the big things to remember are asking concrete questions. So being very specific about the behavior or concept that you're asking about. And so I think this is just best illustrated through an example. So an example of a vague question would be, do you pick up after your pet regularly? So here we have not indicated what kind of pet we're referring to, and we don't really have any parameters around what do we mean by regularly. Is that every day? Is that once a week? And what is regularly to one person might be very different than what regularly is to another person. So a better way to ask that type of question in a more specific way would be to say, in the last week, how many times did you pick up dog waste in your yard? So asking people very specifically about the time, the action, and the place and that we are interested in. The time component has another value. So asking questions that are time constrained. So asking people in the next 5 months, do you plan to use fertilizer on your yard? Or in the next 2 months, do you plan to purchase X, Y, or Z? When you do that, it makes it much easier for people to recall. And so the time frame gives them sort of an anchor by which they can recall previous actions. Whereas if we just ask generally, have you ever, or do you typically, that's much harder to answer and a lot more cognitive load on the participant, which makes the survey harder for them to complete, but also makes the answers less precise. So wherever possible, you want to have a time constraint when you're asking the question, and the specific time really depends on the frequency of the behavior. So if it's something like putting your recycling bin out at the curb and making sure that the lids are on your trash cans, that's something that happens weekly. Whereas if it's something like a fertilizer application, that's something that happens maybe only every several months or once a year, or perhaps not at all. So in addition to being specific about the questions, we also need to carefully construct the response options. So 2 considerations here are that we can unintentionally build bias into the survey and render our results meaningless. So that is by, a lot of us are interested in certain topics, we're planning programs, we're evaluating programs, we're really different than our target audience. And sometimes the list of options that we come up with have our own biases in them. And I'll give you an example of that in just a moment. But 2 ways to avoid bias in those response categories is first, literature reviews. Look to work that other people have done on this topic and what kind of responses they got, perhaps in those other categories, or even qualitative work. Or you can conduct focus groups. If it's a relatively new program or new behavior, it's hard to know what the response categories might be. And then as a third option, including an other response. So if it's possible that there are other options that you didn't think of, or if it's highly likely that there are other options, including that other line allows people a place to write those other responses. This is particularly important when you're doing research around topics that might vary culturally, because we are imposing our own values in those lists. Just one real simple example, some work I did on the topic of washing clothes in cold water about 7 years ago. We, as a research team, came up with all sorts of things that we thought were reasons. We looked at previous reports and we thought, well, people have allergies, people are concerned about smell, people are concerned that their clothes won't be as clean, and those were all relevant choices. However, one of the choices that we didn't think of was people had loyalty to certain laundry detergent brands. And we heard in focus groups that come up a number of times. People had a perception that if to wash their clothes in cold water, they would need to use a different kind of detergent. So the option of brand loyalty as a barrier never would have made our list had we not talked to the audience and done that literature and focus group research ahead of time. So just important to remember that we can build that bias into the survey and to step back and make sure that we've done our homework. The other way that consideration for response option is to include a non-response option. So it is difficult, actually impossible, to analyze missing responses. So if somebody just doesn't answer a question, we don't know if they just skipped the question on accident, if they didn't understand the question, if the question didn't apply to them, or if there was some other reason they didn't want to respond to that item. So particularly when you're asking about things that might be private or sensitive in nature, it's really important to provide that non-response option. And that will vary depending on the type of question, but some examples are not applicable. So this doesn't apply to me. I don't have a dog. It doesn't apply to me. I don't own my home. It doesn't apply to me. Don't know. So rather than forcing people into, I know this or I don't know this, give them an opportunity to say, you know, I'm really not sure of the answer. And finally, I prefer not to respond. And often we're including this now in our demographic items when we're asking about things like gender, providing the other responses as well as a prefer not to response. And that way we are we want to include as many people as possible in answering the questions. Another important consideration in writing the questions is avoiding leading questions. And this is where the nuances really come in. So obviously this sounds like, oh, I would never do that, use coercive language, but coercive language can actually be really subtle. So when you say things like, to what extent do you agree with this? That's different than saying, how much do you agree or disagree with this? So when you say, how much do you agree or disagree, it doesn't imply a right answer. When you say, to what extent do you agree, you're applying to the participant that, well, I should be agreeing, so how much do I agree? Similarly, asking things like, do you believe that it is okay to litter? There are certain topics where people know the right answer because it's socially ingrained in us how to respond. So one of the best ways to detect whether you're being coercive is to pre-test your survey. And I'll talk a little bit about that toward the end of the presentation. But asking people if they feel like there's more than one answer to the questions that you're asking. If there's not more than one answer, then your language is likely coercive. Another thing to be aware of in terms of the way questions are worded is social desirability. In general, your participant wants to look good for you. They want to provide answers that make them look good and that are in line with what is expected of them socially. So for example, if you ask something like, do you ever litter? Well, generally there's a social norm that littering is not approved of. So the response there is very likely going to be no. And we've actually done this and tested this type of language. A better way to ask that would be to set it up like, it's okay if they are different from the norm. So saying something like, if there were ever a time that you littered instead of using a trash can, what was the primary reason? So in structuring it that way, you take that, you make it okay that maybe there was a time that their trash blew out the window, or that, you know, something blew out the back of their truck, or maybe their kid tossed something out the window. But you're giving them an opportunity to not answer in ways that are only socially desirable. Another important consideration is to use complete sentences. So even though we might try to be succinct by saying things like place of residence, that's not very clear in what we want people to provide. So place of residence could be interpreted as, for some people, like, well, is the city that I live in? Is it the state that I live in? Is it the type of home that I live in? What does this mean? So better to say specifically, what is the name of the city where you currently live? And this may not come as a surprise. And for us, people working in stormwater, we run into a lot of this stuff, but use conventional language and language that is well understood by your target audience. So that includes avoiding abbreviations unless they're common. So your local universities might be very well known and you could use an abbreviation there, or USA is generally understood. Avoiding slangs and colloquialisms, because they change over time. So if you're asking people, for example, what communication methods they use to find information, you would want to use response options like internet search instead of saying something like, I Google it, because Google might not be around the next time you repeat this survey, or it might not be universally understood to all of your target audience. And then lastly, just avoiding jargon and technical expressions. So I know we have a lot of those in stormwater, a lot of acronyms, a lot of BMPs and technical terms, remembering that you need to consider your audience. If you're doing a survey of urban planners and engineers or biologists, you can use a different level of language than if you're interviewing or speaking with the general public. Additionally, avoiding overlap in questions is really important. And this is something that we see a lot, particularly this first one here, and that is double-barreled questions. A double-barreled question is essentially two questions in one. So something like, do you use pesticide and fertilizer on your lawn? Well, that's actually two questions because someone could use pesticide and not fertilizer, or they could use fertilizer and not pesticide. So really important to split those up if you want good information as a result. And the other thing to be careful of is just a response overlap. So make sure when you create categories that they are mutually exclusive. So if you ask about age, for example, make sure that those endpoints don't overlap. So you've got your mission statement and you've constructed good items. We are not done yet. In order to make sure that you have a good survey before you go out, it's really important to test that survey. And that is best done through an expert review. And so that would be a technical review to make sure that you're asking about the right concepts and that the survey is well constructed, that it fits to your mission, and that the data is relevant to the questions you want to ask. So that's typically done internally or by other stakeholders. Next, though, you want to review the survey with your audience. And typically this is done first with a cognitive interview. So that is you sit down with a member of the target audience and you ask each question one at a time without providing the responses, and you ask them what they think of, what responses come to mind for these items. And this will help you make sure that the terminology is well understood, but also that you've included the right response categories. Then you've nailed down your survey and you've tightened everything up. A second layer of testing with your audience is to pre-test it. So administer the survey to a small number of participants, and that will allow you to test the timing and make sure that the flow is good and the data that comes back provides you the answers that you need. So there's sort of two layers of audience review that can go into that. So I just want to conclude here with 4 essentials then for implementing the survey. So even if you have a well-designed survey with great questions, if nobody does it, it's not going to help you. So 4 key things that we keep in mind in implementing a survey. First, deliver to the right audience. A well-designed survey delivered to the wrong audience tells you nothing. So if you want to know about people who aren't engaging with your program and you post the survey on your Facebook page, you're only going to get people who are already involved with you. So the first thing to ask yourself is your sample coming from those you want to make conclusions about? So in this particular picture you see there, our interest was in passengers on cruise lines, and the best place to get them was waiting in line at the terminals. And so instead of posting to a Facebook page or sending out a bunch of emails. So ask yourself, who is the audience? Is it all residents? Is it employees? Is it your members or followers? Is it volunteers? Is it somebody else? And is your method getting to the right people? Second, manage the timing. And that doesn't really just mean how long is the survey. We want to keep those less than 12 minutes, but manage timing of delivery. So the appropriate time constraints. If you're going to intercept people as they are dropping their kids off at school, maybe they're leaving a home improvement store and you want them to complete a survey, that's going to need to be a lot shorter because you're getting people as they're going somewhere. You want to schedule around busy times. So if you're interviewing businesses, maybe restaurant owners, you're not going to go in the lunch hour and the dinner rush. You're going to go early in the morning or in the mid-afternoon when they're a little bit less distracted. We've even interviewed in neighborhoods where we don't interview on football day because people are busy and they're not going to be completing surveys, or we don't make telephone survey calls during certain times because we're less likely to get a response. The other way to manage timing is to get your surveys done quickly, and this allows you to avoid real-world interference. So if you're going to administer a survey, you want to keep that constrained to maybe 4 weeks tops of data collection, instead of kind of, oh, over 6 months, we gradually got surveys, because as you get further and further out, more things happen in the real world with weather events or political events or other things that can begin to influence responses over time. A couple of ways to enhance participation are pre-notifications, letting people know ahead of time that a survey is coming. So that maybe mailing them a letter in the mail or sending an email out, letting them know, putting a door hanger out on people's doors, letting them know that someone might be interviewing them. Using trusted entities, so the branding on your surveys, if they're mailing, or the people who are administering the survey are people who are trusted and recognizable. Training interviewers, whether it's in person or on the phone, is really important. So an interviewer that has confidence, that understands the questions and the topics, is more likely to keep the participant engaged. And lastly, making sure that the survey has good logic and flow. So if you follow the sort of process from categories and write your questions in meaningful ways, that shouldn't be an issue. But a questionnaire that's clumsy to complete and jumps all over the place makes participants tired and likely to drop out. And this is really important if you're administering online and making sure that your survey works across different platforms. Establishing credibility is also important, and 3 ways to do that. 1, reduce uncertainty by letting people know what the survey is for, how long it's going to take, and how their information is going to be used. It's really important to establish that up front. Second, to establish the importance and value of their participation. So often we'll say things like, you are one of just 50 people that we're talking to today, or one of just 100 households that were randomly selected. And your information is going to be used to help us evaluate or to help us plan. And then lastly, ensure confidentiality. So ensuring people that their private information will not be shared, that their responses will be combined with that of others, that they will not be called out separately. When you do those 3 things out front, you have much better participation. So there are many, many, many more strategies for implementing good surveys, even within each specific mode. So we do a lot of mail surveys, for example, and we have a whole set of tools that we use in order to enhance participation. But my hope from this is that you really got an understanding that surveys can provide a lot of value to you, both in the planning and predicting and evaluating of your programs and for behavior. But also that it's not just about writing items, that there's a process and a thoughtful process that you follow. And even without all of the depth, just following that process will get you a much better result. But for those who want depth, there are 2 directions I would point you. 1, in terms of books, is the tailored design method. This is essentially our Bible of delivering surveys, and talks about internet, phone, mail, and also mixed mode, which is, hitting people maybe once by phone and then following up by web. There's also the survey kit, which provides a number of guidebooks around survey construction all the way up through analysis. And then in terms of professional associations, the American Association for Public Opinion Research, like you, they hold conferences. They're up on the latest and greatest of happenings in terms of technology, sampling, strategies, statistics. It's a really great group to follow if you're doing a lot of surveys, but also to kind of find consultants and just additional information on these topics. So I thank you for listening today and look forward to any questions that you might have.
Jennifer, thank you. That was jam-packed full of incredible information. Thank you so much. Yeah, we even got a wow with some exclamation points in here. So let's look at the questions that are coming in. The first one has to do with, during COVID, what are the most effective virtual means to reach and gather information?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, we've had to really adapt a lot of our research methods because of COVID. Primarily, we used to do a lot of surveys door to door or intercept. So particularly if we were looking for certain kinds of people, so homeowners, for example, or gardeners, we know where we can go to kind of find people like that. But with COVID, that's been impossible. So we have really ramped up mail surveys. And because the great thing about mail surveys is addresses are known. You can buy lists, you can get them from Zillow. There's a lot of different ways you can get lists of targeted neighborhoods, maybe neighborhoods that have runoff issues or neighborhoods near impaired water bodies. You can get those addresses, and what we do is a 5-point, at least 4 to 5 point context, starting with a pre-notification letter. Then we send the survey mailing, then a reminder, then another survey mailing. That's been the primary way. It's also impacted other research such as focus groups. We've had to use things like Nextdoor, door hangers, postcards to invite people to focus groups, whereas normally we would be out intercepting people in the community. Great question though, and we're still adapting all the time.
Yeah, interesting. Mary wanted to know if you could share your San Diego contact about the stormwater survey, and she also had a question about how can survey data be misanalyzed, or can the analysis sometimes miss some really important nuggets?
Yeah, one of the primary ways I see it misanalyzed is kind of what I talked about creating averages from categorical data. So if you put people into the never, sometimes, always, often, that's 4 categories, and some people answer 1, 2, 3, or 4, you can't create an average there. So I do see that mistake made a lot. And also, sometimes people don't have a good understanding of statistics. So, correlations maybe aren't reported correctly, and or analyses maybe that aren't appropriate. So a lot of times what we suggest is, if you don't have that sort of statistical expertise in-house, that you can maybe leveraging graduate students or universities for some of that expertise, people who are looking for that help, interns, for example, that have had statistics classes. It's not so much that people analyze it wrong. I think they miss a lot. There's a lot more that they could do with the data that they don't know how to do, because they don't know how to do that sort of like multi-level or correlations and regressions and things that are a little more advanced. The biggest problem is usually in not the analysis, but in the administration and the representativeness of the sample. So for example, you can get a survey completed really quickly by using an online panel. Mm-hmm. You have to remember that online panels consist of people who sign up to take surveys for incentives on a regular basis. And so does that represent your target audience? If your target audience is, blue collar workers working 9 to 5 and, running the kids off to school, cooking dinner, they're not the ones that are sitting there likely, taking surveys all day long. So if you're basing your program on, and they'll make it look like, so they will match the demographics of your area. So you'll have even gender split. It'll look, right in terms of level of education, because they pull people that match those, but they're still different because they're people who sign up to do surveys. And so and sometimes that's the best way, given a budget, to get the information, but that's usually a bigger concern than how the data is analyzed, in my experience.
Okay, thank you. How much variety in question types would you recommend in a single survey?
Yeah, not too many. So intuitively, we might think, hey, let's switch it up to keep it interesting. But what happens is people get tired. So every time that you ask a different question type, people have to kind of relearn the scale and rethink, okay, how do I answer this? So a lot of the examples you saw, I had these blocks of questions. If I want to know how people feel about a particular pollutant, I have the same core question and then the same scale for all of those. And then, so usually it is good to switch up. So if you've got a block of a lot of scales, then maybe switch to some categorical items and switch back. Maybe 3 switches, depending on how long your survey is, but blocking those together. So in my mind, I've learned the 0 to 10 thing. I get how to answer that. Okay, and then you go to something else. Okay, I've learned how to answer that. Instead of one item like this and one item like that, that becomes really cumbersome for the participant, whether they're aware of it or not. They'll get tired. Yeah.
good to know. You're like, you're probably like a shrink. I think are almost out of time. So, and I don't see any more questions. So Jennifer, I want to thank you. That was incredibly useful. I'm sure people will be contacting you, and we really appreciate your taking time. And
Absolutely.
it was excellent. Thank you.
Good. Yeah,
And
thanks
thank
for
you.
having me.
And thank you also to everybody for hanging in there. Got really good participation for the end of a 4-day conference. So that's a testament to the interest in your topic.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.